British journalist, critic, and writer known for her work on the transgender experience. In 2010, she began writing a chronicle of her gender reassignment in The Guardian called A Transgender Journey. Hi, Juliet, thank you for being with us today.
Hey.
So first off, what made you get into writing, and why did you decide to share your experiences as a transgender woman?
Well, I got into writing a long time before I did the Guardian series. I was writing short fiction, I was doing a lot of film criticism and literary criticism, art stuff. With regards to writing directly about trans experiences, it was actually a friend's idea, a friend of mine who was a writer called Joe Stretch. He said you should write a blog of this because I didn't have that kind of distance from my own life, you know? So he suggested The Guardian as well, and I approached them precisely because their coverage of trans issues historically had been very minimal, and what they had done was quite hostile, and yet they were still sort of seen as more progressive than the other major British newspapers. So I thought that a blog could be a good way of sort of really explaining what trans living involved in considerable detail and creating a sort of a whole personality around it rather than just a set of medical processes. It just seemed like an appealing project, and I did it, and it seemed to work.
Why do you think that there is such a conflict between some areas of the feminist movement and the transgender community?
It's a long story, and there's a very specific historical context to it, which largely goes back to the sort of 1960s and 70s, because at the same time as you had a sort of a move with transsexual people going from being something that was covered very occasionally in the newspapers, people like Christine Jorgensen in the early 50s, where it was just covered as this very sensational thing. You had a move from these individual cases to a sense of a kind of transsexual community evolving, a sort of recognisable group of people with recognisable characteristics and whatnot. And at the same time, in the second wave of the American feminist movement, you had this real emphasis on setting up women-only spaces. And so I can understand, historically I can understand why there was discussion about whether or not to let male to female, like transsexual women, into those spaces. As is often the case, the kind of loudest and most hostile voices saying, no, we absolutely shouldn't, kind of won the day. And then you get into kind of issues around free speech and sort of a lot of the sort of anti-trans feminists saying, look, we should have the freedom of speech to attack trans people, and trans people then say, yeah, but you're using that to like devalidate our identities, you're not listening to our experiences. And then there's lots of people who don't really understand the issues, who will just think, oh, somebody like Germaine Greer talks about trans issues a lot, she must be an expert. And those voices get kind of prioritised, and kind of transphobia often means that, trans people just don't get an equal footing.
Along those lines, were there any obstacles for you while you were writing your story, and have you ever personally experienced discrimination because of your gender identity?
Obstacles in terms of the writing? Not too much. I mean, I wanted to bring in more kind of trans history and theory, and there was a lot of pressure on me coming from my editors to write very, very personally. So I think the main pressure really was to simplify the story, and I always wanted to bring in more kind of complexity and more of a sense of how I had a sort of history within wider trans community and people before me. In terms of experiencing discrimination, I mean, an awful lot of just abuse in the street, on a daily basis for the first couple of years, really, which was very draining and quite difficult. I mean, I was quite lucky in that I lived in Brighton, in England, and it had a quite big LGBT and T community with support networks, and I was working for the health service, which was, one of the more sort of tolerant employers, but certainly on a social level. And things with my family were difficult for quite a long time. We got there in the end, but yeah, those would be the main ways.
So when did you first question your gender identity, or has it always been apparent to you?
I think I first seriously questioned it when I was 10. That was really when I realised that there was some sort of gender identity issue. Other people had actually sort of twigged before me. Like, really sticks in the mind, like a boy at primary school when I was sort of 7 or 8 years old, telling me that I needed to be more masculine, and I was just like, I don't understand. I mean, firstly, it's just a weird thing for a sort of 8-year-old kid to say, but I just didn't understand why that was necessary. I was sort of, well, I'm fine, thanks. And it was only really when I was about 10 and sort of had this sort of quite visceral urge to wear women's clothes, but also something deeper than that, feeling that I should have been born female. That was when it really became an issue. And really it was there sort of throughout my teens that I sort of started to read up and watch more things about transsexual people in particular, and really start to work that out.
So would you mind telling us a little bit more about your transition and how it's affected your life since then?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because the transition, it took just over 3 years from going to my doctor and saying, look, I want to transition using the National Health Service, from doing that to kind of recovering from surgery. I mean, it actually took nearly 4 years if you include the sort of final appointments with the gender identity clinic. So I went to the doctor and said this, and he said, I'll refer you to the local specialist. It's dealt with through mental health services. So I went to see a clinician who specialised in LGBT issues, and you have an initial screening conversation just to make sure you're suitable for referral to the gender identity clinic. So that took 2 months to finish those appointments. And then there was, I think, a 7-month wait for the first gender identity clinic appointment. And then I saw 2, and that was in London, so I had to travel. So then I saw 2 psychiatrists who would ask you lots of questions about, questions I always get asked about my family, about, when I realised I was trans, what it was like growing up, all those kind of things. And if you answered them to their satisfaction, then after the second appointment, they prescribed hormones. That took over a year. That took 15 months, I think. Started taking the hormones, had like laser hair removal, which wasn't covered by the NHS. I had to pay for that myself. And then sort of eventually, after a few more psychiatric appointments, was referred for surgery, which I had in the summer of 2012. And then there was sort of a recovery process that took a few months. So that was the process, really.
Getting slightly more political. So on Tuesday, a teenage boy in Pennsylvania filed a lawsuit against his school district because he didn't want to share a locker room with a transgender student. What is your opinion on the transgender bathrooms debate occurring in the US at the moment?
I mean, it's quite tiresome. There are so many issues that are real problems for the trans community, like kind of housing, social discrimination, access to healthcare, and hostile outsiders like continually use this issue to pin us into that discussion. So I find it very frustrating, for one thing. I think it just comes from a position of like extreme ignorance. I mean, I don't really know how to resolve it. I mean, over time people will see that this really isn't the problem that people keep saying it was, and it will be looked back on probably in the same way that, people who didn't want to use a hospital that AIDS patients had used in the 80s or something will be looked back on. I think it will be seen as that sort of objectionable and ill-founded. But it's very difficult to stop those people controlling the discourse, and of course in the US now, looking at what's happening in American politics more generally, there's a horrendous wave of reaction and pride in ignorance. So it's a real problem, yeah. I mean, trans activists will continue to raise kind of consciousness, and I think these people will realise that, as far as trans visibility and discussion of our issues goes, like the genie's not going back in the bottle, and nor should it, but it's going to take a lot of time. It's going to be very frustrating.
Do you think that the fight for trans rights and acceptance, do you think it's getting better? And do you feel hopeful for people of my generation? Do you think that they have more support than those of your generation?
I think people of your generation definitely have more support than we did. I mean, as I said in the talk I've just done, in the UK in the late 80s and 90s and early noughties, we had laws in place to effectively stop any discussion about gender and sexuality in schools. And, we didn't really have the internet either, except at the very end of my schooling, and it was very primitive. Whereas, of course, young people now, things like Facebook and Twitter and Tumblr, they all have their problems, but there is just this incredible wealth of information, actual real people that you can talk to and discuss stuff with. Just the touch of a button, on a computer or a phone. Obviously younger people now, tend to have their own computers and phones a lot of the time, and So you don't really have to worry about parental control of those things so much either. So there's fewer access issues than there were in my day, and these conversations are taking place at this incredible pace. So yeah, I mean that does make me quite hopeful for the future, really. It's hard to know exactly what sort of forms movements for trans rights will take, because I mean visibility is incredibly important, and you need kind of possibility models, people in the culture who are accessible to you. But we also need, as I said earlier, like safety at school, in wider society. The murder rate is through the roof, particularly for like trans people of colour in the global south. Sexual health care, all of these things, employment, and visibility alone isn't going to fix those things.
Do you consider yourself to be an activist for trans rights?
Very reluctantly, I get called an activist. I mean, this is a really tricky one. I don't think I've ever quite resolved this, and maybe I shouldn't. I mean, I'm very uncomfortable calling myself an activist because primarily I write, and I write politically, yes, a lot of the time, but I also do a lot of kind of fiction, but then everything is political, I think, and there's politics in everything we do. I mean, the reason I'm uncomfortable calling myself an activist is because I think of activism a lot more as kind of, direct consciousness raising, work with grassroots organisations, and linking them up with like high politics, things like that. And I don't really do that an awful lot, except when I'm really called upon to do it. But then a lot of the writers I liked, sort of French existentialists in the 40s and 50s, sort of Camus and Sartre, people like that, they were very much in agreement that all writing was political. So maybe I should just accept the label and run with it.
What would you say to young transgender people or young people questioning their gender identity?
Trust yourself. There's nothing wrong with you for feeling like this. It may go away, it probably won't. So trust yourself, look online for support networks. There are quite a lot of good support networks now for trans people under 18. In the UK we have a charity called Mermaids, who are very, very good. And I'm sure there are equivalents in certain other places. The resources are there now to help you understand yourself in a way that they weren't in the past. But also be careful. I mean, it is still a difficult world out there, and I think being out, if you can, is really important. Finding people you trust to talk about this stuff certainly is, but also keep safe and look after yourself.
And what would you say to the non-trans body of students and what they can do about discrimination against transgender people?
Firstly, just keep in mind that transphobia is real, and if somebody says they've experienced it, then they almost certainly have. Trust people with lived experience on this, but don't expect those people with lived experience to do all the educating for you, because it's very exhausting for them. Maybe ask those people for other resources that you can go and look at in your own time. But yeah, really, also don't assume that you know everything. Most people do work with good intentions, but we live in a very sort of transphobic society, and if you don't have lived experience of that, there may be things that you haven't noticed that maybe you've taken on board. So yeah, I mean, I think just coming from a sort of a place of good intentions, but not necessarily thinking you know everything, is a good place to start.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks.